Leo Beck Institute, where I am the head of public outreach and a reference archivist. And I run the Leo Beck Institute Book Club. I'm excited today that we're going to discuss The Many Lives of Anne Frank by Ruth Franklin, who is with us today as our guest. So thank you, Ruth, for coming. Ruth Franklin is the author of A Thousand Darknesses, Lies and Truth, and Holocaust Fiction, which, Ruth, I actually read. That was my first introduction to your work. It was so good. She is a finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, and she is a winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography for her book, Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life. Which is also very good, but a little off topic for this. So I wanted to welcome Ruth to us today. She's going to talk about her book for 10 to 15 minutes or something like that. And then as usual, we'll open it up to discussion and questions. So Ruth, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Michael, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone for being here. It's great to be in conversation with you. And since we have a somewhat smaller group today, I hope that you all will be generous with your questions and comments, and we'll be able to have a real give and take here. So I'm going to start by just giving a little introduction to my approach in this book and why I chose to take it. You might be wondering, especially if you have read any of the previous books or biographies of Anne Frank, you might be wondering why a new book about her. And, my answer to that question really is that I felt that Anne's life and Anne's memory were due for a revisiting because of the huge number of misconceptions that have sprung up around her. The biggest of which, of course, is the misconceptions about the way her diary was written and published. And I'll get into a little more detail about that later. But I want to start by just asking, how many people here have I'm sure I often ask how many people have read the Diary of Anne Frank, especially when I'm talking to high school students. I'm gonna imagine, based on the looks of those I see here, gonna imagine that pretty much everybody has probably read the Diary of Anne Frank. And so my question would be more, do you remember when your first reading was? And was there something about the book that, why do you think that, why did the book stay with you, if it did linger in your memory? So I invite you to put your answers to those questions in the chat, and I'll look at them in a little bit. But yeah, do you remember your first encounter with Anne Frank, with the diary? And what was it that made the book meaningful to you? And so, like so many of us, I do remember my own first encounter with the book. I was 8 years old. I grew up in a family of Holocaust survivors, and the Holocaust was, and the need to remember the Holocaust was a major factor in my childhood, I would say. And so I read the book at a very early age. I also visited the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam in the 80s, when it looked a little different from the very commercial enterprise that it's become now. And Anne really was kind of a presence in the background for me as I went on to study Holocaust literature and to become more involved in literary criticism about Holocaust literature. But it wasn't until, a bit later, after these first encounters in the 90s, maybe the early 2000s, I started to notice that the diary was often in the news, that, there might be missing pages from the diary that were being reported on. Missing pages had been discovered. And when this happened, it was international news. And so I was sort of accumulating this dual sense, both of the diary as a kind of a changing object, that it wasn't just the neat little paperback that we're probably also familiar with, it with Anne's picture on the cover. It was this kind of messier document that existed in different versions. That, there were pages here and there's a notebook here. It wasn't clear to me how it all fit together. At the same time, um, it seemed that Anne just became, as the years went on, Anne has become more of an icon than ever. Because her face is on billboards, and people seem to be hungry for any piece of her life. You might know that you might remember from the diary, Anne writing about the chestnut tree in the courtyard of the building that served as the family's hiding place, and the way that she loved to look at the leaves on the chestnut tree. That chestnut tree has since died. It died a few years ago, but before it did, saplings from that tree were taken and planted in gardens and parks all over the world, including here in New York at Manhattan's Ground Zero at the Memorial Park there. There's a sapling from Anne Frank's chestnut tree. That's just one small example of the way in which she has grown to permeate our culture. And it struck me as I began looking into this question of the different versions of her diary and what exactly Anne may or may not have intended by writing it. It struck me that the more iconic Anne becomes as a figure, the farther removed we are from who she was as a person. And so the goal of my book is really twofold. It's divided into two parts. Part one, which I call Anne Frank, is a biography of her. It offers the story of her life, much of it in chronological order, as biographies often are, but with some flexibility to move back and forth thematically. And it's divided up into approaches to her in terms of her different identities with which she's become known over the years. So we see her as a child growing up in Frankfurt, as a refugee, when her family, after Hitler comes to power, takes refuge in the Netherlands. We see her as a target as the Nazis invade and begin their persecution. And then we see her in different ways in relation to the diary. She's a witness as the family goes into hiding and she begins writing what would become the rough draft of her diary. And then I call her an artist when we see her revising the diary, which she did. I'll just take a side moment here and explain that she revised the diary starting in March 1944, after she had been in hiding for close to 2 years. She heard a minister from the Dutch government in exile on the radio calling on citizens to preserve their documents of the war years for inclusion in a future national archive, devoted to the commemoration of what Dutch people had experienced during that time. And Anne writes in the diary that when the residents of the annex heard this, they all made a rush for her diary. They knew that she had just such a document. But it becomes clear as she looks it over that her diary, as she initially conceived it, wasn't appropriate for inclusion in such an archive devoted to the persecution, to the warriors, because it hadn't been written with a public audience in mind. It had been written as an intimate, private document, and she needed to turn it into a public-facing document of persecution, of her own persecution and the persecution of the Dutch Jews. And it's clear, so at that point, she went back and rewrote it from the beginning with that aim in mind. And if you're interested, I'm happy to talk a bit later during a conversation about some of the specific changes that she made, with the goal of turning her diary into a document of persecution. Um, and then, of course, and then the first section ends with her deportation, the raid on the annex, her deportation to the concentration camps, Westerbork, Auschwitz, and finally Bergen-Belsen, and her death in Bergen-Belsen from typhus shortly before her 16th birthday. And then the second half of the book is more of a cultural history of the idea of Anne Frank as it's changed and developed in the decades since her diary was first published. And in fact, I call that section of the book Anne Frank in quotation marks because, as Nathan Englander puts it, Nathan Englander has a short story that deals with some of the tensions of the aftermath of the Holocaust that he calls what we talk about when we talk about Anne Frank. And while he doesn't make it explicit in that story, it's clear that what we talk about when we talk about it, we might be talking about many things, but we're not actually talking about Anne Frank. And I'd make the argument in the second half of the book that so many times when we're invoking Anne Frank, whether it's, in the Broadway play adaptation of her diary or the movies that have been made of it, or the many works of literature in which she appears often as a fictionalized character who survives the Holocaust and goes on to do all kinds of other things, or finally, in the political arena, she's often invoked in the service of causes and ideas that have absolutely nothing to do with her. And this is part of what has led to the many misconceptions around her. That as she becomes an icon, divorced from the individual who she was, a Jewish girl growing up in the Netherlands, a refugee from Germany, a target of the Nazis' persecution, that we tend to forget those details as we make her into a symbol of whatever it is really that we wish her to be. And so my goal in this book really was to restore an idea of Anne as a person, as a teenage girl, and to understand her as a person while investigating her iconicity and what it means, what it means to other people, and what it means for her memory. And so I'm going to read a brief passage from early on in the book that I hope will give a little taste for the approach that I'm taking. Um, from the beginning, I had the idea in my mind that I wanted to write alongside Anne rather than over her. Of course, she's written this diary in which she narrates her interior life so beautifully, so compellingly. It's hard to step into that world as a biographer. And so it felt important to me, again, to write alongside her rather than over her. That phrase popped into my mind before I really understood what it meant. Even though I didn't even understand what I meant by it, I knew that it was important as a guiding principle for this book. And so what I've tried to do, and what you'll hear in this passage, is many voices. I've brought in the testimonies, the memoirs, interviews with some of the people who knew Anne. And you will hear some of their voices speaking about her in this brief passage. And I've also included a generous amount of quotation from her diary. In the text, those lines are set apart in italics, so that they interrupt the flow of the text and they highlight that this is Anne's voice. This is her voice here speaking. As I intersperse my own commentary on giving context to the diary, things that took place outside the annex that Anne may not have known about, but nonetheless had an impact on her life. Um, the historical and literary context in which she lived, and all kinds of other pieces of information that felt important to me in bringing greater depth and context to Anne's story. Again, without erasing it, without displacing her, but trying to add more to her own voice and the way she tells her story. So that's what you're going to hear in this brief section that I'm going to read. And it narrates um, the event that happened that triggered the family's decision to go into hiding. So I'll just explain briefly that starting from around a year before they actually made that decision, Otto Frank, Anne's father, had been preparing a hiding place in the back quarters of this office building where he housed his company. He's been doing that in secret, with the help of a few trusted friends. Anne doesn't know about that yet, but on this day, the family decides to go into hiding. July 5th, 1942, 3 p.m. The doorbell rings. Anne is expecting her new boyfriend, Hello Silverberg. They've already spent the morning together, sitting in the sun. The parks may be off limits, but Anne's apartment has a balcony. Like her, Hello was born in Germany. His real name is Helmut, but he's been living in Amsterdam with his grandparents since 1938, after his father's clothing store was destroyed during Kristallnacht. He's 16, and at first he preferred Anne's sister, Margot, but she was completely unapproachable. When he met Anne at a friend's house, she made an impression on him, despite being 3 years younger. Quickly, he became fascinated with her. The two of them have been going out only for a week or so, but they've spent a lot of time together. He walks her to the Jewish Lyceum in the mornings. After school, they go to the Oasis ice cream parlor or hang out at each other's homes. They speak Dutch together, not German. He loves to hear her talk. She asks him about his family, how he came to the Netherlands, what happened to his parents. They fled to Belgium. He's had barely any contact with them for 4 years. His grandmother thinks Anne is too young for him, but he doesn't care. Like many Jewish teenagers in their circles, he also goes to meetings of a Zionist club. His grandparents don't approve of that either, so he's used to asserting himself. Perhaps this is part of what Anne finds attractive in him. Or perhaps it's just that he's older and clearly interested in her. But it's not hello at the door. A man's voice calls, "Miss Margot Frank." Edith, Anne's mother, goes down to answer. The man gives her an envelope containing a single sheet of paper. At the top, in large capital letters, it reads, "Summons. You are hereby ordered to participate in the police-supervised work relief program currently taking place in Germany, and are therefore to appear on July 15th, 1942, at 1:50 a.m. at Amsterdam Central Station. The following may be taken as baggage: one valise or rucksack, one pair of work boots, 2 pairs of stockings, 2 pairs of underpants, one pair of overalls, 2 sets of bedclothes, one bowl, one drinking cup, one spoon, and one cardigan. Should you fail to give heed to this summons, you will be punished with measures to be taken by the Sicherheitspolizei." Impossible to imagine what goes through Edith's mind at this moment. Mummy was terribly upset. Otto is out visiting residents at a home for elderly Jews. Edith leaves the girls together in the apartment and returns with a family friend. Anne is told that the summons is for Otto, not Margot. Considering how close Anne is to her father, it's not clear why Edith thinks she will find this less frightening. Of course, I started to cry terribly. The doors are locked. The Franks prepare to go into hiding immediately. Anne finds an excuse to drop off a few things with the neighbor's daughter: a book, a tin of marbles, a tea set. She will not say goodbye to hello. So I will stop there and open this up to first to Michael's questions and then hopefully to all of yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ruth. That was great. Thank you. So now we'll